Hey, greetings, everybody, and welcome to Mahamudra for the People. I want to make sure everybody can hear me. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Great, great. Excellent. All right. Oh, hey, Rodrigo. Nice to see you. I was actually thinking about you the other day. And I was like, I wonder how Rodrigo's doing. Very good. Excellent. Good. Okay. Well, so greetings from Massachusetts. That's now the headquarters for Yangti Yoga Retreat Center, which is exciting. Um, so, and now we're going to be, this is more for me, doing Mahamudra, anything else. What I wanted to do, because it's been a little bit of time since we've had some time to check in, let's sit for, and then let's move into about 30 minutes tops of check-in and questions, answers kind of thing. And then we'll keep going with the text. So as we've been doing, as best you can in whatever way feels appropriate given the way you're seated, trying to adopt the posture of the 7 points of Virachana. So if you're sitting in the chair, you don't have to worry about your legs being crossed, but keeping your back straight, but not uncomfortably so. Your chest open, so sometimes said as if you're a vulture flying through the sky, right? So keeping your shoulders open, neck slightly downward. Gaze can be straight ahead or lightly downward. Mouth closed, but not clenching your jaw. And the tongue resting on the palate of the mouth. And then using any of the shamatha techniques or shina techniques that we have done up until this point. So this can be counting the breath or just awareness of breath as it comes and goes. Or it can be focusing on a object in your visual field or a visualized object, a little Buddha, in the crown of your head, for example, or maintaining awareness of the experience of mind itself, right? And just using this as a way of anchoring the mind. And so we'll do this for about 15 minutes. We'll begin right now. Okay, gently bring yourself back to the group. All right, so how's everyone's practice been? Everyone's enlightened.
Do we raise
Very good.
hands or do we
Yeah.
just speak? I'm looking for
Oh,
the raise.
yeah. So while you're speaking now, you can.
Yeah, I started. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, this is my first time attending this group, so I just kind of wanted to say hi. And my practice is kind of going well. I've been following Lama Lena's instructions for Mahamudra, except she moved me to her Trek Chode group, and I'm confused because I'm like, it feels like I'm doing the same thing, but it's got a different name. So I'm trying to figure things out. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so with Mahamudra, what have you been doing? Like what like style of practice?
I sit and I rest my gaze on this little guy. It's more ornate than Lama Lena says to use. She says to use a pebble, but I like this, so I use this. And then when my mind feels settled and I'm not sleepy, I take the object away and then I just rest. I just kind of do Shine without an object. And what she recommends from there is to then go on to differentiate movement from stillness. And when you get really good at that, it kind of becomes the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, no, excellent. Yeah, and that is basically the same or very similar to Trek. So yeah.
I think that's why I'm a little bit confused because I'm like, I'm worried that I'm doing something wrong because it seems so similar.
Yeah, no, so technically, Trekcha and Mahamudra are really similar in terms of style in that in open awareness practices. We could also say they're insight-based practices. The difference between the way Mahamudra is kind of more classically taught is that usually Shine comes first, and in some cases, depending on the teacher or style of practice, there can be quite a bit of Shine. And whereas Trekja sometimes is just introduced in a pretty kind of quick way, which requires then maybe you could say a little bit of a slog sometimes to kind of experience a little bit of stability or quiescence in the experience. But if you have a good relationship to Shine or Shamatha, and your mind is stable, so to speak, then you know it shouldn't be much of a difference at all. So yeah, and so that's good. And with respect to Shine, there's the object. In kind of previous classes, I shared a little bit about how I never really got into counting the breath. That always felt a little kind of heavy or clunky or something like this. The kind of most subtle form is just the mind itself. So just being aware of thoughts, this kind of thing. But yeah, what you're doing is perfectly fine. Yeah. And then, why is there a difference between Trekcha and Mahamudra? And really the main reason why there's this is because technically you could say that they come from different schools, right? So Trekcha you typically find, or you could say Trekcha maybe originated, as a Nyingma form of practice. Mahamudra, uh, you know, came up through the Kagyu and then but then ended up in all the traditions. And you find it in the Nyingma tradition, you find it in the Gelug. There's basically just a slightly different style of approach. Yeah, and that's the main thing.
That's clear, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Does anyone else have any thoughts? Or yeah, Anne.
I was just looking at I was doing a practice with a deity and focused on that, and then after that I did some formless practice, and it seemed to lead quite nicely into formless practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so, you know, in a way, you know, Deity Yoga has all the components of Mahamudra or even, you know, Trekcha in it, right? So if one is doing some, you know, Yidam practice, there's an element of concentration, an element of kind of settling into this, you know, sense of oneself as the deity. And in doing this you could say it's like shamatha with like the visualization of oneself as the deity, or this kind of felt sense, you know, of oneself as the deity, settling directly into that experience. But then, you know, what is the deity's mind, right? Which is, you know, the deity's mind and your mind are the same, and the deity's mind and your mind is no different than, you know, this kind of open awareness that you find in formless practice like Mahamudra and Trekcha. So we can, you know, sometimes if we get too wrapped up in, I'm not saying you're doing this, but if at any time we get too wrapped up in categorization, right, we might say, we'll see all of these different kinds of meditation and we'll, you know, put them in little boxes, and then it just becomes a lot of different stuff. But the simplicity of Mahamudra is present in Yidam practice, and the even greater simplicity, where you could maybe say effortlessness of Trekcha is there as well, right? Because there's no difference between Vajrayana or Tara, Manjushri, right? The nature of the mind of Tara, Vajrayana, and Manjushri is Rigpa, right? And the nature of it. And so when you just settle, you know, just like, oh, what's interesting is that in a number of different commentaries on a variety of different kinds of Yidam practices, especially when you get into the kind of like different, you know, levels of practice, outer, inner, and secret, it's often said that if the practitioner can rest into Mahamudra as the Yidam, then that's really the best, right? Like you don't need to go through all these different stages. So I'm bringing this up just to this is kind of so to say the point of all of this, right? Is to be able to experience this you know, vast, open, spacious awareness as the Yidam, or to experience it you know, on the cushion doing Mahamudra or Trekcha, but then essentially, eventually, to be able to be doing this, you know, in whatever it is that you're doing.
Okay, and just one other thing. I actually was building the visualization of the deity on the top of my head as opposed to being the deity. Can you talk about those what the differences in that, because I don't really know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the differences, the differences here are important because essentially Yidam practice is a way of disrupting attachment to this, you know, body, and, you know, this is the kind of, you know, locus point of all experience, but then also, you know, inadvertently the locus point of all of our suffering as well. So there is kind of, we could say, like an alchemical transformation kind of thing that happens with Yidam practice, where we're transforming our relationship to body. We're therefore also transforming our relationship to space too. You know, when we do Yidam practices, the environment around us becomes the mandala of the deity as well. And so we've transformed quote unquote self, we've transformed location. The location, all different Yidam practices will have, you know, the location will have different attributes, right? So if it's medicine, Buddha would be Tanaduk, and it has a particular kind of feeling, right? Vajrayana is maybe a little bit more intense. But the point is like we're simultaneously working with deconstructing this attachment to self, opening up to the illusory nature of self, opening up to the illusory nature of location, and then all of these things, you know, the essence of Mahamudra and Trekcha. Whereas if we're just visualizing, so it's hard to, I mean, I suppose you could self-identify with a small deity right above the crown of our head, right? But the Yidam practice is really about like, and you know, a metaphor I like is those things, nobody uses them anymore. Stitch rippers, those little, you know, kind of devices that you just run along a stitch, and it's like a little blade that's curved, almost, you know, like this. And once you get it through like one loop of a stitch, it will cut all of the others, and then you can take your pocket off if you need to resew it or something like this, right? But we're ripping the stitches of, so in my case, Justin, right? Justin is, as you know, male. Justin is being a particular, you know, shape and, you know, having particular qualities, so that, you know, we can experience reality in a more awake way. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's helpful. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not quite sure how you go about creating oneself as a deity, but that's that.
Yeah. Well, so just so really the transposition, right, of the deity as you, right? So if we take Manjushri, right? So Manjushri holds a sword, right? And so Manjushri's seated, you know, lotus position, holding a sword. There are different kinds of Manjushri, but you know, most typically he's orange in color. Right? His hair is kind of up in a top knot. Right? And the sword represents the sword of wisdom. And so in a very kind of, you know, shamatha or, you know, shine like way. So if you close your eyes and begin to visualize yourself in that form, right? Orange in color, right? Holding the sword of wisdom right above your head, right? Having all of the, you know, Sambhogakaya ornaments of bangles and things like this, right? Seated in lotus position on a lotus itself. Right? Or Vajrayana, red in color, right? Holding a curved knife and a skull cap, right? At the level of her heart. And she's red, her hair, you know, depending a little bit on the sadhana, there can be a little difference, but sometimes it's wild. Sometimes the top part is, you know, in a top knot and the rest flows down loosely. She has a necklace of 50 freshly severed heads. She wears bone ornaments. And so, you know, the first time or second time or third time, maybe the visualization isn't very clear. And I think what's also important to remember is that it's not about, you know, it's about two things, right? The sense of embodiment as a deity, and also a felt sense of her qualities, if we're talking about Vajrayana, or his qualities, if we're talking about Manjushri, or whomever's qualities. And so we don't need to, you know, obsess over like, oh my God, my visualization isn't absolutely perfect. However, I did have a teacher who was very kind of insistent from time to time on really like, you know, he would say like, stop and look at your hand and visualize your hand. So we're talking about Vajrayana. He's like, you know, behold your hand is hers, right? So, you know, with her, you know, sometimes she's depicted with long nails, right? She's got bangles, her hands are red, you know, all of this kind of stuff. As a way to begin to kind of, you know, I guess you could say, like your manifestation her. But anyway, so that we could say that this is the shamatha or shine like aspect of it. But then, you know, if you're reciting the mantra or not, right, her mind is Dharmakaya and your mind is Dharmakaya. Right?
Okay.
And so within the context of Mahamudra, how do we experience Dharmakaya? We experience it by resting into awareness, right? Spontaneous and liberated awareness. And again, you know, like Alex, you know, pointed out, sometimes we're tired, right? And so that freshness will last, you know, a millisecond, right? Sometimes we're you know, really well resourced in terms of having gotten sleep and things like this, and then we can really maintain it, you know, for a longer period of time. But there's, you know, and you find this particular instruction given over and over again in different contexts, both Mahamudra and Dzogchen, about practice being, you know, essentially a way of familiarizing ourselves so that we can gain greater and greater stability with experience, right? So
Okay.
oftentimes, you know, we'll sit down and, you know, sometimes the visualization can feel complex, and then we'll kind of kick ourselves for not getting it right the first time, third time, fourth time, 10th time. But, you know, previous Dogo Kensei Rinpoche, I've also seen, you know, second Duja Rinpoche write about this. Boko Rinpoche talks about this, you know, pretty much everybody talks about this. That really just the gentle, and when I say gentle, I mean kind of self-compassionate, like return to practice, return, you know, eventually at some point it begins to click, you know. Is that helpful, Anne?
That's really helpful. Thank you. That's very helpful. And and when you have a certain amount of awareness, settled awareness, whatever arises just arises and falls and rises and falls. Is that correct?
Exactly. And very similar to the way Alex shared, and I think, I don't remember the number of weeks ago it was, but when I shared it by oh god, was it Tashi Gelsen or something, about same thing, stillness, you know, movement and awareness, right? So when the mind is still, this is the kind of thing, you know, meditation is really well when my mind is still, right? There's not a lot of thinking, but essentially there's no difference between the mind that is still and the mind that is, you know, like a crazy wild monkey, right? Well, why? Because it's the same thing, right? Like, you know, we learn through this practice in a very embodied way to be able to see that thought activity and lack of thought activity is essentially the nature of your mind, and as is awareness, right? So when we start kind of preferencing one over the other, where we're really kind of making much ado about exactly all the same things, right? So we can save a little bit of time, I think, potentially, when we're aware of this, right? As opposed to kind of building slowly. But then there are different kinds of practitioners too. You find this in a whole host of texts where they talk about spontaneous types, gradual types, and middling types. And this is kind of important to remember too. It doesn't have anything to do with somebody's intelligence level, or, you know, if you're a good person or a bad person. This is really just like, you know, are you tall or short or in between? Like, you can't say short people are terrible or tall people are great, or tall people are terrible and short people are great, you know, or people in between are the best, right? It's just what's happening, right? And so with respect to typology of practitioner, same thing. Some people really benefit and are gradual types, you know, yeah, stable support really causes them to be able to kind of, you know, move in a really nice way. Some people really just, you know, are instantaneous types, and they'll, like, you know, shoot, you know, up to the heavens, so to speak. And you might think that that's better, but it's also a little volatile. You know, is meaning it can be a little unpredictable, which is not always a good thing. But if that's
No.
your type, what are you gonna do?
No, that's not my type.
You should set up like a dating app based on people's meditation types.
No speed dating.
Exactly. That's the like, you know, the poem. Yeah, Jasper, how are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm kind of trying to work out this problem or question or whatever it is. It kind of dovetails off what we talked about on Sunday in terms of self-liberation or allowing things to self-liberate, feelings or thoughts or emotions when they arise. And I guess I'm wondering about like the distinction between when like allowing things to self-liberate and when you are bypassing the experience of something to avoid it, or well, because sometimes I feel like I'm drawn to Mahamudra at times when I'm like, I just want to check. I mean, subconsciously, I think I just want to check out, and I can sit down and kind of just open my awareness into spaciousness and be like, ooh, whatever, like everything's space, nothing matters anymore, really. But that doesn't necessarily feel right, or maybe it's just my own discomfort with non-attachment. But I feel like there's also a distinction between non-attachment and like detachment.
Yeah.
So just, I guess, looking for some guidance around the mess of terms that I've.
Yeah, so yeah, I think, yeah, this is a good and very kind of subtle point, because it could be argued that so resting into open, spacious awareness is done without effort, right? There's a certain effortlessness associated with it. You know, like there's no Jasper pushing the cart, right, into, you know, the experience of Rigpa. That kind of effort is something that we essentially need. You know, we're in the process of deconditioning ourselves from. So if we find ourselves efforting into, you know, space, maybe we are bypassing, right? Maybe we are, you know, and again, like bypass sounds like you know, the problem with bypassing is it sounds like a really negative term, right? And in one way, within the context of meditation, perhaps bypassing is not skillful. But in another way, I think you could say in more contemporary terms, it can be a little healthy sometimes as a protective mechanism too, right? If our whole, like, you know, nervous system is fried, right? Maybe it's good to just kind of, you know, insert a little space, right, for the sake of doing that, right? Within the context of meditation, though, we want to try and be as open and accepting and really, you know, occupy this place of, it's not detachment as much as it is you know, being comfortable with letting go. Right? Detachment runs a little cold, right? And in fact, you know, the more that we settle into open awareness, the more that we connect to things around us, right? Because we're able to see, experience, direct, you know, there's less conceptual stuff getting all wrapped up, you know, like I don't need the reasons why I might be in love with somebody. In that experience of being in love, like that's enough, right? So detachment has this kind of absence of quality, which is a little disconnected. When we're settling in a connected way, it doesn't matter if you're not, right? It's just thing. So one, detachment is kind of cold. Detachment is detached. I mean, it's not connected. It's there's something else going on. When we rest truly into open, spacious awareness, it doesn't really matter what's happening, because there is a sense of that it's okay, right? It could be something really intense. Like I know that the metaphor that was used the other day was, working in a kitchen and just all the stressors and all this kind of stuff that can happen. But I think also like it's important for us to cut ourselves a break too. Like if we work in an intense place or we're constantly having intense experiences, maybe it's not so skillful to show up super clearly all the time, right? Maybe it is helpful to take a step back from time to time, right? And this is the kind of difference between bringing the view straight into a challenging experience rather than kind of building it. Like, we have to know why we're doing this, right? We're not doing it to just like, we're not in a rush. Like, I got to nail Mahamudra, right? Like once I nail Mahamudra, then I can, go do something, really fancy or something like that, or get some kind of title, because it doesn't even work that way, right? Like Mahamudra, the openness of Mahamudra really, like, in order to really approach it, you begin to let go of attachment to these kinds of things, right? You're letting go of attachment and letting go of aversion. And what you're describing is kind of, rooted in aversion. I don't want to feel. So like, screw this, The interesting thing about what you're bringing up though is that Bokar Rinpoche used to bring this up quite a bit, that the kind of unintended negative consequence of becoming too attached to shamatha or shine is that you can run the risk of being reborn in a formless realm, right? Meaning that, if you're doing this just to kind of like quell, like the feelings. Oh, I'm tired of feeling. I'm just going to really like, hone in on my like, especially the concentration aspect of shamatha. Then, shamatha, because it lacks the insight piece, isn't a full kind of, path, as it were. Right. And the insight piece is awareness, right? It's the mind's ability to be aware of itself, the mind's ability to be aware of this kind of co-arising relationship between self and other. If we just want to kind of concentrate on something to make everything else go away, right? We're really avoidant of reality. And that's not so good. But the good thing is if we find ourselves experiencing that or doing that, we like, I honestly don't think there's a lot of benefit in getting all like, harsh with ourselves, because it doesn't help. Course correction is really like it can be a matter of seconds, right? Notice, release, relax, keep going. The moment we're like, oh shoot, man, like I was just doing this, like what are you supposed to do? Like, apply some kind of remedy, like, do Vajrasattva, like that doesn't make any sense, right? We're just trying to click right back into that spacious awareness. And this is the thing that also connects both Mahamudra and Dzogchen to this idea of sudden awakening, right? So if we become too attached to this idea gradual, gradual polishing of the mirror kind of thing. Yeah, if we find ourselves attached in a meditation session, like, yeah, then you really need to polish that attachment out, right? But does it really work that way? You know? Is that really the way the mind works? Is our mind a wild monkey that needs to be tamed? Right? Or is it something that is, self-liberate in these other moments? There's a big difference between self-liberation and silencing. Is that helpful?
Definitely, yeah. If it feels, sorry, my window's open. Yeah, it feels, well, you were just talking about with Anne before about like thought and spaciousness or whatever it was, but the mind, it's both. There's no real difference between, it's just whatever is happening in the moment. And I think there is, well, it's gone now, but whatever I was thinking. So I guess that's the point.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is like, so it, like, I know, like one of my teachers is Dr. Nida Chinatsang, and the things he teaches is Karma Mudra. But I'm bringing this up because, the first time I ever heard this was not from him, it was from Boka Rinpoche. He was saying that the different, these different kinds of experiences through which we can experience the nature of mind very quickly, right? And one of them is said to be orgasm. The other one is sneezing, right? Or being kind of shocked or startled by something, right? And when this happens, right, or losing one's train of thought, right? We could have this whole train of thought going, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, oh my God, like I'm not, like, where, I don't even know where I am. Right? And that is like a prime place to be able to settle into the Rigpa state. Right. And this is like, why I like that is it's really inconvenient for people who are really methodical builders of systems. Right. So if you're like, this is the path, it's a 45-degree angle, like do not deviate from this particular approach, right? And then you're like, wait, man, like, what are you talking about? And it's like, I don't know, I forgot what I'm talking about too. And then both people rest into kind of openness. Well, then, like, what kind of 45-degree angle is that? It was kind of like you're going up and then you just shot straight up. Like it's our own, sometimes our own, that's not even intelligence, our own, memorization of stuff that we read really, gets in the way from time to time. Yeah, does anyone else have anything? And then yes, Eric.
I'm not completely sure what I'm going to say, but let's see where it's going. It's about the difference between stillness and motion. For the last 3 weeks, I had quite some time to do some more shamatha meditation. And what I noticed is it is often said that there should be no difference between stillness and motion. And in the beginning of the session, there clearly is a difference between sometimes you're grasping onto the motion of the mind and you're getting into a story. But if the mind settles down a little bit and there's a little bit more clarity, then you can see your own thoughts, the movements coming up and disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering, the stillness I do not recognize, whereas the movements I do recognize as being Eric. is this a kind of a still grasping, but a more subtle way of grasping onto the movements to recognize them as myself? Or I'm just getting confused there, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the question is only if you think that these thoughts come from you, right? Like, where do they come from? Right, so the existence of movement, the existence of thoughts, like we can we can fight them, right? But oh my God, that's going to be exhausting, especially because we can never find where they come from, right? There's no birth canal or anything like that, and no source, right? Because when I challenge anyone to name it, right? Because if you say, "Oh, it's my brain," that you don't know that, that you're just regurgitating kind of information about, neurology. So what about space? Like a still, clear mind. Is that your mind? Is that your experience? Yeah. And so when thoughts happen, how could that be yours? Like, where do do they come from your belly button? Like, where do they come? Like, you experience them, but you also experience stillness, and you also experience awareness, right? But is it like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, you can't find the place.
Yeah, but the stillness is open, mysterious, luminous, and in a way you do not recognize it. Whereas the thoughts I do recognize, and that's why I'm wondering if it's still a subtle form of grasping
To thoughts.
to the thoughts. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Stillness, like absence of thought, can be felt, right? And experienced, right? The difference between like sitting in front of a brick wall and meditating, and on some kind of like Irish cliff, looking out over the Atlantic, right? Seeing for, Lord knows how long or how far. That's palpably felt, right? And the stillness that can occur, right? And so there is an experience that's happening, right? But experience doesn't have anything to do with you, because it's not an identity that is doing any experiencing, it's awareness itself, right? And what is the nature of awareness, right? Awareness, like we'll think of our eyes, or we'll think of our brain, right? The things are, all of our sense consciousnesses. And of course, there is a connection between sense consciousness and the organs themselves, but the consciousness is not the consciousness is not owned by the sense either, right? So they're essentially just happening, right? And again, it's not particularly helpful for me to say that, because what we all need to do as practitioners is to practice into that experience, right? Keep going and keep going, keep going. Like, who is the experiencer of, either one of these things? And what? Because, again, what you're saying is that there is a difference between the two. What is that difference? Right? Just because you say that doesn't mean it's true. It's kind of like, Shabkar in Song 3 of Flight of the Garuda. This is where he begins his whole, like, where's the mind? Is it in your, is it in your brain? Is it in your heart? And it's funny because, like, in performative Buddhist spaces, people know it's not their mind, and so they'll always say it's in my heart. And it's like, oh, you're being too good, like I get it. But like you're trying to say the right answer, right? And so this is the thing, it's like each one of us need to find it for ourselves. And it is in a different place or the same place even for all of us. It's that it's theoretical until it's definitively experienced. Then when it's experienced, it's it's one of these things. It's kind of like you can't unsee that. Was that helpful, Eric?
Yeah, it's helpful. It's telling me just move on, just go on with the practice and see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. And and which is the whole kind of purpose of this kind of familiarization part of the practice. It's just coming back and coming back and coming back, but not in a painful way, right? So maybe here then, I'm just going to jump into the section, which I've touched on already a couple of times, but I'm going to touch into it one more time, right? And this is this idea of cutting uncertainty, right? And so Rinpoche writes, he asks, like, how do we cut through uncertainty with this? And he says that, we do this by searching, right? So by looking. And again, like searching here doesn't mean, like when he first taught this, I was a quite young, person to now, and maybe too intellectual at the time, right? So like I had this kind of set up as a call and response kind of, experience where, where's the nature of my mind? Oh, I can't find it. But it can't be that, that is helpful in the beginning, but then it's really like feeling into it with awareness, right? So when we search, if we do not find anything, right? Then who's the one who's searching? Right? And we really have to be curious of this. How does the mind arise? Right? So how does the experience of mind, happen in the beginning? Right? How and where does it dwell? And where does it disappear? Right? The thinking mind. Right? Just feeling into all of these. And the most important thing being, we need to be really methodical about this, right? And not because, again, we're bad people, but because this is how we know for certain, right? And he knows these 11 different ways of, kind of these phases of recollection. So the first is thorough search and analysis, right? And what the problem, we should just be careful with words, right? So again, he was writing this in Tibetan, and this text was kind of has this kind of an inconvenient aspect where it was translated from Tibetan to French and from French into English, right? So it means that there's plenty of room for there to be some kind of mistakes in the translation. But so when it said, thorough search and analysis, right? It's really, we could just say, looking in a very thorough way. And if it's helpful to use the term thinking mind, as long as you're not, creating multiple kinds of mind, right? But if it helps, you can use that, right? So where does it come from, right? And then where is it when it's happening? And then if it begins to dissipate, where does it go? Right. So this kind of thorough examination, this thorough analysis. And then what he calls separate analysis, right? So looking at all of the different points, every little experience, right? And really, like, again, this can feel like busy work. Why in the world am I doing this? Do it for the love of it, right? Do it because you're extremely curious. If you look at something and almost instantly an idea of what it is and this kind of, all this cogitation is happening. Why am I doing that? And so this is this very kind of, looking at all of the little bits of the way that we experience things. Right. So there's separate analysis and then detailed analysis, right? So really getting into all of this. And then Shina, right? Shamatha. And shamatha is really ultimately like beautifully complex because it's not just focusing on something. Right, when we get to the much more subtle aspects of Shina or shamatha, we're really talking about like feeling into mind itself. It's a mind is not a thing. When we talk about stability of mind, we're really talking about breadth, right? This mind being vast. This is where stillness comes from. And then comes lakton, or superior vision, which is translated as vipassana. I like there being a little bit of a differentiation between this kind of vipassana and what we see in other traditions, because it is a little different, right? Because we're also looking at mind in relationship to time, right? So I think in another class I shared, Bokram Che has this reflection, right, on looking at the mind in relation to time. And so is mind controlled by time, right? Can it be divided into the 3 times, right? Or not? Is it just always in the present? Right, how big is mind? Where is the edge of it? Is again, is the edge of it in your room or house, or is it outside? Or does it end at the border of your country? Does it go all the way into the center of the earth? And so this, but using the same kind of, ethos, right? About, continuously looking. Because again, we're trying to break the cycle of mind is right here. My mind, not your mind, my mind. I am losing my mind. And then, so, there's shamatha on one side and there's vipassana on the other, or laktong. And then Mahamudra is bringing both of them together, right? And this can feel a lot, we could look at this too simplistically. Oh, well, I just do this together. I set the stage, right? So kind of like set up my shamatha and then rest into awareness, right? But Mahamudra itself, right, is the natural union of both of them, right? Natural meaning effortless. Right? This is the combining. In the beginning, combining is artificial, right? Because we're learning how to. That's kind of like getting to know somebody, right? The first time you spend time with them, it's, you know, it's good. It might have some awkward moments, right? You're kind of like learning people's, you know, body language and communication style and all this kind of thing. It becomes, you know, more kind of innate over time. And then, you know, like with a good friend, you might see them, you know, I think most people have friends that you only see maybe once every couple of years, and it feels like you've never, you know, been out of their presence, right? So like this. Now, how is this possible, right? Shamatha, like, you know, really become good at shamatha. That stability of mind, this kind of experience of quiescence, right, already begins to kind of edge right into Lakton, right? Because mind is so stable, right? Doesn't mean necessarily still, because there can be thought activity. Right? But you could say the canvas that all the thought activity is painted on is wide and well stretched, right? Well prepared. So whatever occurs on it is able to be experienced without distraction. Right? If you try and stretch a canvas with, like, you know, one staple on each side, right, you're gonna have this wobbly surface, right? And, you know, it will distort the image that's painted on it. Right? So if your shamatha is, you know, becomes something a little bit more innate, a little bit more automatic, because you're very comfortable with it, then Laktung naturally, it kind of begins to, you know, it doesn't need a lot of effort necessarily. In the beginning, though, maybe it does, because, you know, we have all these weird ideas of who I am in relationship to time, right? How we're educated to be individuals, right? That doesn't particularly help. Right? All these things. So what we're really doing is disrupting the status quo, you know, through Lakton. Which isn't surprising because, you know, Mahasiddhas of India, for example, were, you know, some of the progenitors of these practices, right? There are people who were constantly, you know, looking and re-examining and re-examining and examining, you know, social customs, examining organizational structures, right? Examining relationship to superstition. And it's hard to be superstitious and practice Mahamudra at the same time. That doesn't really work. So then when you combine both, then clarity begins to happen, right? Because you're able to understand not only mind, but when we understand mind, we understand and have a very clear relationship to phenomena. Because but all of our ideas aren't being placed on everything. Now, a good example of like how samsaric our minds are with all this stuff is like, look at the earth. The earth is like this, you know, planet. And if you look at it from space, you can't see all the borders, right? You can see the shapes of continents, you know, perhaps, right? But you're not going to, you know, you only know what Egypt is because of how you've been educated, right? I know what Egypt looks like, but there's no indicator of Egypt when you're, you know, on the moon looking at the earth with a telescope, you know, or the United States. Yeah, some places are a little lucky because they're the size of almost of an entire continent, right? Australia, that's kind of easy, right? But there's no indicator that that's Australia, right? And all the weird things that are done on this planet, you know, just done, you know. All right, this is like the conceptual mind. It's just a lot of stuff. You know, some is beneficial, some is quite harmful. right? Some is, neutral, right? In every varying thing, but all quite odd, and all ironically also quite creative. Right, so clarity is beginning to kind of recognize this. Over time, clarity leads to non-thought. Right? And non-thought isn't like duh, like not being, being a like a mimbo. It is there being no conscious referent, right, to whatever is happening. Right. So it's no I, am thinking, and I'm thinking my brilliant thought, and there it goes. Right. It is a very automatic, very experience is not self-conscious, in this way. And I think that's not a bad term, but so it's a little different way than, when we say self-conscious, we feel a little shy, right? I feel a little awkward, right? This isn't about awkwardness or being shy. This is about, just being very, clearly knowing, right? And not making a big deal out of anything, not connecting any dots. And then equanimity. Equanimity is, arises when we have fully understood that there is no difference between thought activity, stillness, and awareness. And so there's a very good description of this by Mipam, but I think that passage I shared from Gampopa is also quite similar. But again, Boka Rinpoche says this, and Wangchuk Dorje also says this, that again, we have to be methodical in the sense of, really trying to master our craft. Again, not because we're stupid, but because that's how the whole thing clicks. And then comes non-interruption. Right? So for anybody who's like, shh, meditating. Right? And there's this differentiation between mudra and samsara. If there's that differentiation, then you're not, in the experience of non-interruption. Right? Non-interruption is, it doesn't really matter, right? Because I've realized that it's all okay, right? It's all within. The last is non-distraction. Right? Non-distraction, because everything is, it's like they say, like, for a hammer, everything is a nail. So for the yogini or yogi or whomever of Mahamudra, everything is perfected spontaneity, the play of liberated appearance. There's no differentiation, there's no distraction. It could be some, middle of forest and it feels nice, but I could be in the middle of Times Square, right? Or in the middle of Mexico City, or in the middle of Paris, or on a boat that's sinking in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, or, finding my spacecraft is not going to get me back to Earth. And now I'm stuck, right? It's all okay, right? Because even when you die, same thing happens, right? Experience just happens. Right? And then when you're reborn, new experience happens. And then as you go through that next life, it's the same thing. And so, this asks us then to, in the beginning stages, Like really feel into, does the mind exist or not? What is its essence? Right? Search in the stream of the experience of mind and look and look and look. Right? But when I say look and look and look, it doesn't mean like you need to do it for 30 years. Right? You look until you can't find anything. Right? Okay, and then you try it again. No, couldn't find anything. Right when you're like, okay, now I got it. There's nothing here. Right? Then you go a little bit deeper. Right? Eliminating doubts about color and shape, origin, location, appearance. You know, when thinking mind disappears, do we freak out? Or when thinking mind disappears, are we like, ha ha, you know, yes, I got it. Like that's too much of a reaction, right? Because it will come right back. And we're like, oh no, it didn't work. And, you know, the searcher, whoever that is, right, searches all the way to the end, looking for who it is that's searching and what is being searched for. And when you realize that the mind has no inherent nature, the mind tends to be able to remain perfectly stable and profound. And when that happens, we begin to, you know, have these glints of the experience of our own face, as it were, right? Our own nature, right? Our Buddha nature, Sujata Garbha, right? Because all of the distraction has been the distraction, the separation, all of this kind of, you know, frenetic energy that we're constantly investing in. You know, this or that or more, or, you know, whatever. And then if we become tired or lethargic, agitate the mind, shake it, you know, like a snow globe, and look. And then if there are too many thoughts, stabilize the mind. You know, in the past, they've had the techniques with the bindu, right? Like the white bindu right at the brow, right? In order to, you know, when we're feeling very lethargic, we can focus on the bindu right at the brow. Or feeling very frenetic, you can focus on a black bindu right at the navel. You know, there's another technique where you can imagine that this black bindu goes all the way down into the center of the earth, right? Just kind of like bringing you down. But this is also important too, because, you know, typically, I mean, most people their minds are like kites, right? So if all of a sudden someone's feeling angry, like New York City, if somebody's feeling angry, then they go and hit someone, you know, and they don't even know why they're doing it, right? If someone's feeling, you know, love, they just grab someone and kiss them, right? Like this is what we're constantly like unconsciously reacting, right? So as we begin to actually truly understand our mind, right, which is what all this is doing, we can also understand the way that we can, you know, address mind when it's full of torpor or you know, feeling like it's full of sloth, right? Or when it's very agitated and frenetic, right? You know, mind is not such a big deal. We don't have to freak out all the time. We actually have some agency here. Right? And when we're free from both torpor and agitation, then we just keep going with searching and examining and looking. And, you know, in a manner of speaking, we can call this whole relationship to mind a form of yoga. And if we hold to this in this way, right, and we truly try to kind of move through it in a stable way, we don't have to be overly, overly disciplined, but we also, don't benefit if we're too loose. So, feeling into who it is that we are and how we are, our typology, and just, going at the pace that feels right. There's no race. Like Saraha's not there with a trophy. People cheering you on, all the Mahasiddhas, right? They're cheering everybody on no matter what. It doesn't matter, if we're the first to do it or the next or the last, because, ironically, our mind is always, perfect, always liberated. And so this, we could say, is the ethos or the style or what is it? Oh man, like the Chicago manual of style, right? This is the Mahamudra manual of style, right? How to write a resume, how to, cite, footnotes, right? This is how to each thing, right? And there are people who will kind of make it more intense than it needs to be. Like, do this because, otherwise you'll be stuck in samsara forever. I don't really care much for that kind of like, I just don't, we're all good at making ourselves feel very guilty. We don't need more of that. Okay? And, again, like, I do think there's a lot of utility in remembering the transparency of samsara. Right? Samsara is not a death sentence. Right? Like, I'm not saying this because I because I refuse to suffer. Right? I'm saying this because, otherwise enlightenment would be the aberration. And I don't think enlightenment is the aberration. I think it's at least 50% of the coin. Right? Maybe even more. Right. So the good thing about this is that, we're right about to be at time. So whatever comes next, like bring this kind of, style of, we could say processing, but maybe that's too much, it has too much baggage. This way of being open and free and loose, but very creative, like, feel into your own kind of style of this. Ultimately, this transcends every kind of system that exists, including religion itself. This is the great liberator, right? Just like Dzogchen. And so let it be that for you, like what does that mean? What is the mind beyond all of that stuff? Right. And then if there's any part of you that's like, whoa, man, that's so intense. That makes me uncomfortable because I'm Buddhist. Well, then look at that. Where is that Buddhist you? Is it here? And you can't say it's in your heart because that's cheating. It's not there. It's not in your toe. It's not in your hair. It's on your teeth. Right? Where is that? What is that? And why is that so important? Yeah. 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 And Boku Rinpoche's book on meditation advice, and thank you for that, is and I didn't realize you have a PhD from university. Yeah. Yeah, so Boku Rinpoche's book is really good. There's like a day in the life of the Buddhist practitioner or something like that. Is really, really, he was so incredible. He was such a great teacher. And very, 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 very compassionate and kind. right? And not somebody who's really big into, making people feel guilty, or empowering people to feel guilty. So try to not do that. So maybe we'll break here and dedicate the merit to all beings, no matter where they are or how they look or what dare I say, what their politics are. May all beings be completely liberated and free, no matter where they are, whether we're able to even conceive of them or not. And may our mind essentially rest into its own nature as spontaneously liberated Rigpa, free of every single reference point. And may that blissful state lead all beings to be able to recognize their Buddha nature. So, take care, everyone. Be well. And greetings, Donya. See you all soon. Be well. Bye-bye.